Why you wanna fly, Blackbird?
The abolition movement was a reform movement during the 18th and 19th centuries that pushed to end the institution of slavery. Often called the anti-slavery movement, it sought to end the enslavement of Africans and people of African descent in Europe, the Americas, and Africa itself.
Cause your mama's name was lonely, and your daddy's name was pain.
We most commonly recognize the abolition movement in the United States, where many brave men and women, both black and white, worked to abolish the cruel world of slavery.
Never love again.
At a young age, children would be sold into slavery, sometimes separated from their families, and would often work in cotton fields, plantations, and even in their masters' households, where they would face harsh treatment and could only hope and dream for freedom.
You ain't got no one to hold you. You ain't got no one to care.
The start of the colonization movement dates back to various plans first proposed in the 18th century. Colonization entailed dividing the blacks and the whites and sending African Americans back to Africa, where they would live in a colony, which later became the independent nation of Liberia. Some blacks supported emigration because they thought that black Americans would never receive justice in the United States. Others believed that African Americans should remain in the United States to fight against slavery and for full legal rights as American citizens. Some whites saw colonization as a way of ridding the nation of blacks, while others believed that black Americans would be happier in Africa, where they could live free of racial discrimination. In September of 1829, David Walker's appeal, arguably the most radical of all anti-slavery documents, caused a great stir when it was published, for it called for slaves to revolt against their masters. The goal of the appeal was to instill pride in its black readers and give hope that change would someday come. It also spoke out against colonization. David Walker, a free black originally from the South, wrote with such vengeful and hateful words that even William Lloyd Garrison, an outspoken abolitionist, objected to Walker's appeal. William Lloyd Garrison was one of the most dynamic abolitionists of his time. He was a very religious man and truly believed in the freedom and equality of blacks. In 1830, he started an abolitionist newspaper titled The Liberator, which he is well known for. In 1832, he helped form the New England Anti-Slavery Society and held many meetings where abolitionists would meet. Frederick Douglass was born a slave, but escaped at the age of 20, and later went on to become a world-renowned abolitionist. Douglass was a prominent American abolitionist, author, and speaker. He is well known for his 3 autobiographies and was one of the most influential abolitionists of his time. In the 1830s and 40s, the gag rule prohibited any involvement in anti-slavery activities for members of Congress. Finally, in 1844, John Quincy Adams finally wins repeal of the gag rule in Congress. In 1850, the Fugitive Slave Act was passed, which allowed slave hunters to recapture freed or escaped slaves. Harriet Tubman was a famous abolitionist who was born a slave and later became a conductor on the Underground Railroad, leading other slaves to freedom in the North. The Underground Railroad was a network of secret routes and safe houses used by 19th century slaves in efforts to escape to free states with the aid of abolitionists and allies who were sympathetic to their cause. Harriet Beecher Stowe was an author and social activist. Her father, Lyman Beecher, was a leading Congregationalist minister and the patriarch of a family committed to social justice. Stowe achieved her national fame for her anti-slavery novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin. Uncle Tom's Cabin paints a grim picture of life under slavery. The main character is a pious, passive slave who is eventually beaten to death by his overseer. John Brown was an abolitionist from the 19th century who believed that the only way to free slaves was through military force. In 1859, Brown and 21 of his followers attacked and occupied the federal arsenal in Harper's Ferry. Their goal was to capture supplies and use them to arm a slave rebellion. During the raid, Brown was captured and later hanged. With the many women involved fighting for the rights of slaves, they too began to realize that they could fight for their own rights. These same women started the women's suffrage movement. The Grimke sisters were abolitionists and suffragettes. They grew up in a family that owned slaves. Later on in their lives, they converted to the Quaker faith and became abolitionists. Angelina was in close contact with William Lloyd Garrison, another abolitionist. In 1837, Angelina was invited to be the first woman to speak at the Massachusetts state legislature. Sarah and Angelina Grimke wrote the letter on the condition of women and the equality of sexes, objecting to male opposition to their anti-slavery activities. Sojourner Truth was a prominent abolitionist and women's rights activist. Born a slave in the New York State, she had at least 3 of her children sold away from her. After escaping slavery, Truth embraced evangelical religion and became involved in moral reform and abolitionist work. Sojourner Truth boldly made her views and voice known by all, even President Abraham Lincoln. In 1864, Truth went to visit Lincoln in the White House, where they discussed their abolitionist ideas. In 1861, Abraham Lincoln became President of the United States. In 1863, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which declared that all persons held as slaves are and henceforward shall be free. And finally, in 1865, the 13th Amendment is added to the Constitution, completely abolishing slavery.